Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras. Coming up in today's newscast, Iran and the United States butt heads in the Middle East as American officials issue dire warnings. Israel and Kosovo solidify ties in a first-of-its-kind virtual ceremony. And later we take a deeply needed dive into the Israeli political scene that's rapidly evolving ahead of March elections. The IDF facing a seemingly new issue this week as a military quadcopter drone falls outside of Israeli borders for the third day in a row. Terror groups in Gaza reportedly getting hold of the first and latest UAVs to be lost after they fell in the Strip on Sunday and Tuesday. Then in southern Lebanon on Monday, Iranian terror proxy Hezbollah announcing that it had successfully downed the second UAV to be lost. But while the IDF confirms that the drone crashed and fell into the hands of Hezbollah, they deny that the drone was shot down. And the IDF also claims that no information was leaked in any of these three incidents. Israeli drones are known to allegedly fly into and out of both Lebanese and Syrian airspace on a near daily basis to gather information or scout targets. Meanwhile, upping Israeli defenses as well, the IDF successfully completing tests on the latest version of the Iron Dome missile defense system. In the advanced testing, this time also including the Air Force and Navy in order to simulate a number of advanced threat scenarios. Now, United States officials are issuing dire warnings as they discuss the foreign policy challenges facing the new Joe Biden administration. Speaking to NBC News on Monday, United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken is warning that Iran is potentially just months away or less from nuclear breakpoint, meaning having enough fissile material to build a bomb. This as Iran continues violating restraints set by the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. Blinken adding that it's a problem that could get more acute and could even get down to a matter of weeks. Likewise, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan outlining the new White House's priority in restoring constraints on Tehran's nuclear ambitions that began deteriorating more quickly after President Trump pulled the United States out of the deal.
From our perspective, a critical early priority has to be to deal with what is an escalating nuclear crisis as they move closer and closer to having enough fissile material for a weapon. And we would like to make sure that we reestablish some of the parameters and constraints around the program that have fallen away over the course of the past 2 years.
But far from Washington's expectations of returning to and adding to the JCPOA, Iran is acting with added aggression. Spokesman of the Foreign Ministry, Saeed Jatizadeh, saying that bilateral talks with the U.S. are unnecessary and will not be held on the issue, adding that the U.S. must return instead to its commitments and lift sanctions imposed on Iran. This while Tehran announcing plans to restrict short-notice inspections of suspect nuclear facilities starting February, as well as to enrich uranium up to and over 20%, well beyond the 3.5% permitted under the original agreement. Then doubling down, IRGC Chief Hossein Salami, claiming that despite the economic crisis, Iran is in a position to work towards overcoming sanctions without remaining in the nuclear deal if need be. As for how D.C. will respond, critics are arguing that Iran's playing hardball will pay off, and that Biden will likely end up returning to the faulty 2015 nuclear deal as is. And they point to the appointment of Robert Malley as the new United States envoy to Iran as proof. Malley having negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal in the first place under President Obama. Israel, for its part then, hoping that the Biden administration will at least consult with Jerusalem as promised before making any decisions. Joining us now with more on the nuclear crisis, research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism and at the IDC Herzliya, Dr. Fadi Ismail. Dr. Ismail, thank you so much for being with us. Now, starting with the back and forth between Tehran and Washington, D.C., we've previously heard that the conflicting demands are just a starting point for negotiations. Do you agree, or do you think that the Iranians are playing hardball again with the American administration that they basically know from 2015?
First of all, good evening to you. Thank you for having me and to our fellow panelists. Sure, I mean, we know what President Biden believes in. He was part of the previous administration, and they are trying to go back to some kind of a conversation with the Iranians, perhaps going back to something like the JCPOA plus a couple of mentions of ballistic missile capabilities and anti-terrorism. frankly, I think the Iranians now have are behaving in the way we predicted they will once President Biden was elected. The Iranians now have something that did not have before, and that is predictability. They know more or less what they are facing. It is a very far cry from what they had in the last 4 years, and therefore they feel that they can advance with a much more a clear path forward. Whether they want to develop an actual weapon or whether they just want to remain as a threshold state, which probably pays them more. Maybe it's better for them at this point in time, at this junction, to remain as a threshold state. Now they know that they don't have to worry, or they think that they know that they don't have to worry about some unpredictable counteraction from Washington, D.C. So that, and that is why we see that rhetoric being upped on the Tehran side. From the American side, we have a dilemma. On the one hand, President Biden does not believe in Trump's policies. He does not want to repeat them or continue with them. On the other hand, he says he doesn't want to become a third Obama administration. So he wants to be able to negotiate the points that President Trump originally brought up. Again, the ballistic missiles, we'll have to see. After all, he's a very experienced leader. And I'm very curious to see what comes in the next few weeks.
All right, well, it's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out in the coming weeks. Dr. Ismail, thank you again so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, speaking of security cooperations, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praising his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi on Monday for safeguarding Israeli officials in the wake of the bombing last week in New Delhi, an attack just outside the Israeli embassy, which Jerusalem is now treating as an act of terror. A statement from Netanyahu's office detailing how Modi responded, noting his country's commitment to security and continued cooperation with Israel in fighting terror. But that said, Indian police are still looking into the culprit or culprits behind last Friday's explosion, saying the low-intensity IED was likely a mischievous attempt at creating a sensation.
पौने 6 के लगभग की
पौने 6 बजे की कॉल थी और क्या कॉल क्या थी क्या कॉल क्या थी
कॉल यही थी कि बम ब्लास्ट हुआ है वहाँ पहुंची
अच्छा तो कोई नुकसान हुआ है क्या कोई
नुकसान का हमें नहीं पता शीशे 3 गाड़ियों के शीशे टूटे हैं वो हमने नंबर ले रखे हैं
तो आपके पास ब्लास्ट की कॉल थी
ब्लास्ट की कॉल
कलेक्ट करे हैं हमने सब आईओ को हैंडओवर कर दिए हैं एक्सप्लोजन था अभी क्या एक्सप्लोजन था ये लेबोरेटरी में एग्जामिनेशन के बाद केमिकल एग्जामिनेशन के बाद ही हम लोग बता पाएंगे
Well, the investigation is ongoing, still gathering all the pieces and the evidence that we get from the scene and pieces of information from all over. There is a full collaboration between the Indian authorities and the Israeli authorities. And as of now, our assumption, strong assumption, that it is a terror attack.
And as for naming a suspect, so far primary leads are still hinging on a handwritten note found at the scene in which the previously unknown Indian Hezbollah claims responsibility. Meanwhile, partnerships with Israel expanding now to Kosovo as Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi accepts the European country's request to open an embassy in Jerusalem, and this making Kosovo the first Muslim-majority country to do so. Ashkenazi therefore presenting a plaque at the virtual ceremony, which will be placed at the embassy's entrance.
The establishment of a relationship between Kosovo and Israel is yet another important, exciting, and historic step. This morning I received your formal request, Madam Minister, to open your embassy in Jerusalem, which of course I approve, and I look forward to seeing it open very soon, hopefully with you.
And also attending the ceremony, which marks the first time two nations have remotely established diplomatic ties, was Kosovar Prime Minister Hoti and U.S. State Department Representative Matthew Palmer, who hailed the warm ties between the two nations as a long time coming, a sentiment likewise shared by Kosovo's foreign minister at the meet.
Kosovo has waited for a very long time to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. On this important day, we mark a new chapter in the historical bond between our countries, who have witnessed a long and challenging path to existing as a people and to becoming states.
Kosovo and Israel first announced the intention to establish ties back in September at a summit at the White House. Serbia, which also pledged at the summit to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, has yet to act on that promise. IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi is making hard choices this week, ordering all soldiers in closed units to be kept on base until further notice. The Army head essentially canceling leave then for any unit not yet vaccinated or green, effective immediately. And this is in light of dangerously high and still rising coronavirus infection rates. Hannah Rifkin with the details.
Despite roughly a third of the population getting at least one of 2 vaccine doses and an ongoing lockdown, cases of coronavirus in Israel still rising to a dangerous national contagion rate of 9.2%. That's roughly 1 in every 11 people being infected, leading Israeli HMOs then to call on the government to open vaccine eligibility to all age groups, especially as turnout has seemingly started to plateau. And as the total number of active cases overnight rises to over 71,300, 1,143 in serious condition, and 4,863 dead. Meanwhile, contrary to the falling number of cases in the Haredi sector, the infection rate among the ultra-Orthodox still remains at nearly double the national average, with roughly 1 in every 6 being sick. And this largely caused by continuing protests and massive illegal superspreader events. The disparity, however, drawing increasing criticisms from the public over lack of equal enforcement in COVID restrictions. Police seen fining and reprimanding individuals spaced meters apart in Tel Aviv for drinking coffee in Dizengoff Square, and within distances from home allowed by the law, all while tens of thousands in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods flood the streets with no opposition.
וואו, וואו, וואו. אוי ואבוי, תראו מה קורה פה. 3 שוטרים על בן אדם אחד מסכן שכל פשעו היה לשבת ולשתות את הקפה שלו בכיכר דיזינגוף. תלמי את זה! נותנים לחרדים להסתובב חופשי ובן אדם יושב בכיכר ואוכל פיתה וזורקים אותה לרצפה! תתביישו!
That said, it's unclear for which reason the man was detained, be it breaking restrictions or running from police. In any case, Police Superintendent Asi Aharoni responding in that enforcement between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is just different, adding that while the latest funeral event saw 15,000 people, it could have been 100,000 had the police not blocked dozens of buses from reaching the area. Further, he says that had police used force to disperse the crowds, there would have been hundreds trampled or worse.
Moving on, Israel's 4th round of elections in just 2 years' time is now just a month away. And some serious changes to the lineup have continued streaming in ahead of the February 4th deadline to finalize party lists. Joining us to break it down, though, is J-Post correspondent Gil Hoffman and Ynet journalist Liran Friedman. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, first off, in the wake of all the protests and the mass events, critics are hoping that the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, will lose power at the polls. Do you see this happening? Liran, I'll start with you.
This all honestly always depended on if the general public votes. The Haredi base has always been 8 seats for Shas, 8 seats for United Torah. I honestly don't even see it changing, but the thing that is showing up is support for Yair Lapid, which has been a very vocal opponent of the Haredi and joining with them in any sort of government. That's, in my opinion, the only sign of really anything changing.
Well, Gil, a follow-up. What about now that United Torah Judaism head Yaakov Litzman is entering this rotational deal for control with Moshe Gafni, and as Shas's number 2 is leaving politics altogether? I mean, there are some changes going on here. Do you think that will have any effect?
That agreement was reached 2 years ago. That's really a technical agreement, but there are definitely huge changes that are happening right now. We're seeing the impact of the ultra-Orthodox being at the top of the news every night. It's had an impact on Yesh Atid, as Liran said, going up in the polls, hitting 19 seats in a poll this morning. It's had the impact of a reform rabbi getting the 2nd most votes in yesterday's labor primary to win the 4th slot on the labor list, which is a big deal in an effort by labor members to try to take votes away from Yesh Atid. And it'll only boomerang with the ultra-Orthodox. They're not going to lose power from this. They're going to gain power from this because that makes them even more motivated to go and vote. And that's how we saw Netanyahu, for the first time in a long time, in a poll this morning, being able to form a coalition if Naftali Bennett would go with him because the ultra-Orthodox would have enough support. Netanyahu's got to hope that the ultra-Orthodox actually stay in the headlines, and if not the ultra-Orthodox, then Iran, which would help him even more.
So on that same vein, Liran, back to you. With that poll in mind, They're saying that the right-wing bloc can get to 61 votes, which is the majority in the Knesset for a coalition, but only if they get Yamina, Naftali Bennett's Yamina party involved, possibly even Gideon Sa'ar, who has already promised that he's not going to be joining with Netanyahu, but Bennett has not made that same promise. Do you see Yamina joining with Netanyahu's Likud?
I honestly don't trust Bennett anymore, personally. Bennett has had way enough opportunities in his not that short, not that long political career to make a stand and say, no, we're not going to support Netanyahu. If he's going for the ticket right now of no Netanyahu, no coalition with Netanyahu, that's all fine and dandy. If he wants voters to come in, that's all great. But the results are going to come in on March 23rd, and on March 24th, he's going to have to make a decision. Do I trust him not to join Netanyahu? No. And I think most people don't. And I think that most people that vote for Bennett now, the core voters of Yamina, the religious Zionists, and the more liberal right-wing voters to go to him, still believe that if the chips are down, he's going to go with Netanyahu.
Gil, back to you. What does the balance in the end actually look like then? Because we've seen a lot of difference of opinion when it comes to the polls, and now we're seeing this poll that the right-wing bloc can actually make it. But Telem has dropped out. Yesh Atid is gaining in power. UTJ and Shas are in flux, as we discussed earlier, and Labor, of course, as well. How is the balance of power shifting?
Look, there are two political camps in Israel. They're not right-wing camp and left-wing camp like they used to be. There's a pro-Netanyahu camp and an anti-Netanyahu camp. The pro-Netanyahu camp now has only the Likud and the true ultra-Orthodox parties. The anti-Netanyahu camp has in its 6 parties, where you can have Yair Lapid and Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman and Blue and White and Labor and Meretz all joining together, maybe Meretz only from the outside. And you can get 61 quite easily with those parties if they handle themselves smartly. There's decisions that need to be made over the next 2 days. Ron Hodei dropping out of the race would help his camp. Does he have enough modesty to be able to do that? Obviously, if Benny Gantz would take his party out, it would be helpful. He doesn't have the modesty to do that. Labor and Meretz, it would be helpful if they run together. I don't see that happening. So there are a lot of steps that maybe would need to be taken in order to help bring Netanyahu down that probably won't happen.
All right. Gil Hoffman, Liran Friedman, thank you both so much for your insights today. All right, in other news, the focus on clean and green technology is still going strong in Israel, and it's now being highlighted in the exciting Sustain IL 2021 startup competition, the online contest aiming at finding solutions to environmental challenges and celebrating Israeli companies that lead in the trend. And the event is hosted this year by Startup Nation Central, an independent nonprofit that connects Israeli entrepreneurs to world leaders, NGOs, businesses, and more. But of the more than 100 applicants to Sustain IL, just 6 were chosen to compete as finalists against a panel of judges. And of the 6, waste conversion startup companies UBQ and Clarion took home the top prizes for mature stage track and early stage track innovations, respectively. Still, never shy of challenges, remaining Israeli entrepreneurs continue to reinvent themselves using their knowledge to impact the world for the better. Israel ranking 6th overall in the Global Clean Tech Innovation Index. Now, speaking of prize-worthy achievements, results from a recently published research paper may soon pave the way for landmark treatments against various brain diseases. Imagine a technology giving a detailed Google map of the location of genes inside the brain. Well, thanks to an Israeli-led research team, such a technology is on the verge of occurring. Teams from Bar-Ilan University, Harvard, and MIT detailing how they analyzed the hippocampus of the brain without destroying any tissues. Or put another way, while doctors have for years struggled to analyze RNA or ribonucleic acid from brain tissue, now they can do so at the nanoscale resolution level. And this is likely leading to breakthroughs in the fight against Alzheimer's and other similar illnesses. Research author Dr. Shachar Alon saying that it's the equivalent of having a vast and detailed Google map of the location of genes inside the brain and other tissues, rather than a low-resolution image or a simple list of the genes that are there. And on to our final story tonight. The battle between Reddit investors and Wall Street hedge funds is capturing the imaginations of everyone in the world of investments right now. And in Israel, where new investors are opening accounts in record numbers, it's no different. So can a GameStop-like situation arise in Israel's comparatively conservative market? With me to discuss is ILTV contributor and expert in international consumer behavior and marketing, Billy Abraham. Billy, thanks so much for being with us. Now, Can this happen in Israel? That's the main question.
Well, as you said, there is a record number of investors opening accounts in Israel, but we have to see what is happening in the United States. In the United States, there's greater activity on the stock market that is fueled by credit provided by banks. There's also a greater distribution of stock ownerships, and trading overall in Israel is more conservative and regulated. So now it doesn't look like it's something that could happen. However, we might have to be looking into portfolio managers and investment advisors and see whether more regulation could be placed in that particular area. But in general, in Israel, it's more conservative, and I don't see something like this happening.
So so rather than something happening in Israel per se, how else might the GameStop revolution and other similar events that are still ongoing affect the international and/or Israeli market specifically?
So if you look, for example, the reactions that we've seen in the United States, I think that even in the United States, there might be more regulation as far as websites and forums that give recommendations to investors, and these recommendations are many times not based on data. Investors should always make decisions based on the performance of a company in the past and prospects to increase profits in that company. For example, if the company is about to launch a new product, a new generation of products, or maybe launch into a new market. So if you base your decisions on that, you are more likely to make a better decision and a better informed decision.
So is there anything that investors, especially new investors, should be on the lookout for to protect themselves?
Well, so I think that in the United States, there will be an eye out on forums like Reddit by the White House and different senators and governors. But if you look at new investors in general, like I said, there are a lot of websites that present objective data, graphs that show the performance of companies in the past, prospects for the future. And taken together with market conditions, you can make better decisions. And I would not base my decisions based on things that people say in different social media outlets and forums. It's really risky because usually, look, if you look at GameStop, sure, its stock market has increased by 1,700%, but it did decrease significantly. So it's a bubble that usually blows up in your face. And if you invest a lot of money, you'll just lose all your money or most of the money.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us a heads up. Vili Abraham, feel better as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Lows tonight are expected to hit an average of 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 13 degrees Celsius, while tomorrow's highs will reach an average of 74 degrees Fahrenheit and 29 degrees Celsius. So is it still winter in Israel or not? We're not exactly sure, but today is Groundhog's Day, and we got word that Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. So that means just 6 more weeks of winter, if at all, for all of you bundled up across the Atlantic. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Like father, like son, I guess? 2 peas in a pod. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.3 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.